March 20th, 1941. Quonset Point Naval Air Station, Rhode Island. Otto Brandenberger stood in ankle-deep mud, staring at half-finished runways stretching toward Narragansett Bay. The envelope Admiral Ben Moriel handed him contained orders that would define his entire career. Design a portable military shelter, strong enough to survive combat zones, light enough to ship anywhere, simple enough that 10 untrained men could build it in one day. Oh, and deliver the first units in 60 days. Every military engineer knew what happened when you rushed construction. Men died in collapsed shelters. Roofs tore off in storms. Walls buckled under their own weight. But the British Nissen hut design they'd been given had a fatal flaw. That curved steel shell meeting the ground. It wasted half the interior space where soldiers would actually live. Otto's hands shook as he studied the blueprints. His partner Peter looked at the impossible deadline and said 4 words. "We can fix this." What they created would either save millions of American lives across the Pacific or become the greatest engineering failure in military history. March 20th, 1941. Quonset Point Naval Air Station, Rhode Island. Otto Brandenberger stood in ankle-deep mud, staring at half-finished runways stretching toward Narragansett Bay. At 38 years old, he was the only licensed architect at George A. Fuller Company, and he'd spent the last 6 months reviewing construction progress on this naval expansion project. The work was routine. Federal contracts, government paperwork, nothing that would change history. Then Admiral Ben Moriel appeared beside him, carrying a manila envelope sealed with Navy Department stamps. Otto wiped mud from his hands before accepting it. Moriel was chief of the Bureau of Yards and Docks, the man responsible for every naval facility from Pearl Harbor to Iceland. He didn't make social calls to construction sites. "Read it now," Moriel said. Not a suggestion. Otto tore the envelope open. The orders inside were typed on official letterhead, single-spaced, brutally concise. Design a portable military shelter. Make it strong enough to survive combat zones, light enough to ship anywhere in the world, simple enough that 10 men with no construction experience could assemble it in one day using only hand tools. Deliver the first production units in 60 days. 60 days. Otto read that line 3 times, certain he'd misunderstood. "Sir, this says June 1st. "It does. That's 8 weeks. "I can count, Mr. Brandenberger." Otto's hands began to shake slightly. He'd served in the Army during the last war. He knew what happened when you rushed engineering. Buildings collapsed. Bridges failed. Men died because someone cut corners to meet a deadline. "Admiral, with respect, proper testing alone requires—" "We don't have time for proper testing." Moriel's voice was flat, final. "War is coming. When it does, we'll need to build advance bases across the Pacific faster than the Japanese can sink our transports. We need mobile infrastructure that ordinary sailors can erect under fire. The British are already using Nissen huts from the last war, but they're inadequate. You're going to design something better." The Admiral pulled a second envelope from his coat. "British specifications. Study them, improve them, then build me 8,200 units for immediate deployment." Otto stared at the knower. 8,200 shelters in 60 days, starting from scratch. Moriel was already walking away, boots squelching in the mud. "Your country is depending on you, Mr. Brandenberger. Don't let us down." Otto stood alone in the cold March wind, holding 2 envelopes that had just become the most important objects in his life. Around him, construction crews hammered and welded and poured concrete for runways that would launch patrol aircraft into the North Atlantic. Routine work. Predictable work. Nothing about the next 60 days would be routine. Back at Fuller's temporary office, a converted warehouse 3 miles inland, Otto spread the British specifications across a drafting table. His partner Peter de Jong leaned over his shoulder, reading silently. Peter was 53, a career engineer who'd built bridges and factories and military installations for 30 years. He had the kind of calm competence that came from solving impossible problems so many times they stopped seeming impossible. The Nissan hut blueprints showed a simple half-cylinder of corrugated steel, like a culvert pipe cut lengthwise and laid on the ground. The design dated to World War I, invented by a Canadian engineer named Peter Norman Nissen. British troops had used them by the thousands on the Western Front. "It's elegant," Peter said quietly. "A continuous arch distributes load evenly. No complex framing. Just curved steel panels bolted to a simple rib structure." Otto was sketching modifications in the margin, his pencil moving fast. "But look at the footprint. The arch meets the ground. You lose half your interior space where the walls curve down. A 6-foot soldier has to duck when he's more than 4 feet from the center line. And there's no floor, just dirt. And no insulation. The British version is just 2 layers of corrugated steel with an air gap. It's a steel tent." Peter studied the drawings for another minute, then straightened. "We can fix this." Otto wanted to believe him, but his hands were still shaking. Over the next 72 hours, they rebuilt the Nissan concept from the ground up. Add a raised plywood floor, 1-inch tongue and groove planks that would keep men off frozen ground or tropical mud. Layer in masonite interior walls with paper insulation sandwiched between the inner and outer steel shells. Redesign the T-shaped steel ribs to carry more weight and bolt directly to the floor framework. Make the entire structure modular, packable into 12 wooden crates that fit standard cargo holds. Otto's architectural training gave him the spatial intelligence to see what the interior would actually feel like. Peter's engineering background turned those visions into load calculations, material specifications, and assembly sequences. They worked 18-hour shifts, fueled by coffee and the terror of missing Moriel's deadline. On March 23rd, 3 days after receiving the orders, Otto delivered preliminary drawings to the Navy Bureau in Washington. The procurement officer who reviewed them was a lieutenant commander named Harrison, a career logistics man who'd spent 20 years moving supplies around the world. Harrison studied the plans for 20 minutes without speaking. Finally, "This is heavier than the Nissan." "By 400 pounds per unit," Otto admitted, "but it's insulated, has a real floor, and we estimate it'll be 30% warmer in Arctic conditions." "How fast can you build them?" "We don't know yet. We haven't built one." Harrison looked up sharply. "You're asking me to approve a design you've never tested. You're asking me to deliver 8,000 units in 57 days. Sir, we don't have time to build prototypes, test them, then manufacture. We have to do everything simultaneously." The silence stretched out. Harrison was calculating risk, weighing unknowns, making the kind of decision that could end his career if it went wrong. "Provisional approval," he said finally. "Start manufacturing. But if your first unit fails assembly testing, we cancel the entire contract." Otto's throat was dry. "Understood." Fuller's management made the most audacious decision of the entire project. They started building the manufacturing plant before finalizing the design. At West Davisville, Rhode Island, construction crews worked 24-hour shifts, erecting a sprawling factory complex in 30 days. It was a gamble that violated every principle of rational business planning. If the Quonset design failed, Fuller would own a massive empty factory with no purpose. But if it succeeded, they'd have the production capacity to meet Moriel's impossible deadline. Meanwhile, Otto and Peter faced their biggest technical problem. How do you bend corrugated steel sheets into a perfect 8-foot radius curve? Flat corrugated panels were strong because the ridges added structural rigidity, but bending them meant forcing those ridges to compress on the inside of the curve and stretch on the outside. Push too hard, and the metal would split along every corrugation line. They brought the problem to Anderson Sheet Metal Company in Providence, Rhode Island, one of the few fabricators in New England with the equipment to handle large-scale bending operations. Anderson's chief engineer was a man named Sullivan, 60 years old, who'd been forming metal since before Otto was born. He examined their specifications, ran some calculations, then shook his head. Can't be done. Not reliably. Not at the scale you're talking about. We need 8,000 units, Peter said. That's 160,000 curved panels. Then you need a different design, flat panels, angled sections, something that doesn't require bending corrugated stock. Otto felt something cold settle in his chest. They were in week 5 of 8. The factory at West Davisville was almost complete. The Navy had already ordered 8,200 units for immediate deployment to Britain under Lend-Lease. Admiral Moriel expected the first huts shipped by June. Every day of delay meant more American troops would be sleeping in canvas tents when the war came. And Otto knew the war was coming. Everyone knew. The question wasn't if, but when. He stared at the corrugated steel sample on Sullivan's desk, running his fingers along the ridges. Somewhere in this metal was the answer. It had to be, because failure wasn't an option, not when millions of lives would eventually depend on what he built in the next 3 weeks. Sullivan's shop foreman turned out to be the man who saved the entire project. His name was Jonas Petruskas, a Lithuanian immigrant in his mid-40s who'd worked sheet metal for 20 years. While Sullivan declared the bending operation impossible, Jonas stood quietly in the corner of the fabrication floor, running his calloused fingers along a sample of corrugated steel, listening to the sound it made when he flexed it slightly. "Maybe not impossible," Jonas said in accented English. "Just impossible the way we've been thinking about it." Sullivan turned. "You have an idea?" "Cold bending tears the metal because we're forcing it all at once. But what if we don't force it? What if we let the metal tell us how it wants to bend?" Otto leaned forward. "I'm listening." Jonas disappeared into the back of the shop and returned with wooden blocks, clamps, and an acetylene torch. "We build a jig, not a press. A jig with graduated pressure points. We heat the seams slightly, just enough to make the steel more forgiving. Then we roll the sheet slowly, incrementally, letting physics do the work instead of fighting it." He spent the next 6 hours building a prototype bending apparatus that looked more like a wooden cradle than industrial equipment. The corrugated panel sat in the jig, while Jonas adjusted pressure points along its length, heating specific spots with the torch, then gradually tightening clamps to coax the metal into a curve rather than forcing it. Otto watched the first panel emerge, a perfect 8-foot radius arc. No splits, no tears. The corrugations remained intact, still providing structural strength. He held it in his hands, feeling the ridges under his fingers. The metal was warm from the torch work. This might actually work. Peter was already calculating production rates. "How many jigs can you build? How many panels per shift?" Jonas smiled slightly. "Give me 2 weeks and I'll have 3 jigs running. We'll hit your numbers." But that night, sitting alone in the drafting room at Fuller's temporary office, Otto stared at the calendar on the wall. They had 23 days left until June 1st. The factory at West Davisville was complete and waiting. Anderson's crew was fabricating panels. Strand Steel Corporation in Detroit was producing T-rib sections. Lumber yards were cutting plywood floor panels and masonite interior sheets. Everything was converging toward a deadline that allowed zero margin for error. But they still hadn't built a single complete hut. Only pieces. What if the pieces didn't fit together the way the drawings showed? What if the assembly sequence looked simple on paper, but proved impossible in practice? What if the instruction manual Otto had written made perfect sense to him, but was gibberish to ordinary sailors who'd never built anything more complex than a bookshelf? The entire project rested on one assumption, that untrained men could assemble this shelter in one day using only hand tools. If that assumption proved wrong, 8,000 huts would arrive at advanced bases as useless piles of metal and wood. Otto needed proof, real proof, before the Navy committed to mass production. May 15, 1941. The first prototype stood in an empty lot beside the West Davisville factory. 16 feet wide, 36 feet long, 8-foot radius arch. From the outside, it looked like a half-buried metal culvert. Not beautiful, not impressive, just functional. Otto brought in 10 Navy recruits for the assembly test. Not Seabees, that legendary construction force wouldn't exist for another 10 months. Just ordinary sailors. Ages 19 to 47. A farm boy from Iowa named Dale Hoffman. A mechanic from Detroit named Jimmy Torres. A grocer's son from Boston whose hands had never held anything heavier than a bag of flour. None of them had construction experience. That was the point. The test parameters were brutal in their simplicity. Assemble Quonset hut number 001, using only the instruction manual, standard hand tools, and 1 day of daylight. No supervisors, no engineers standing over their shoulders offering hints. Otto and Peter positioned themselves 50 yards away, forbidden from helping. Peter checked his watch every 5 minutes. Otto tried not to imagine Admiral Morial's reaction if this failed. At 0800 hours, the sailors unpacked 12 wooden crates. Inside, curved T-rib sections, corrugated panels, plywood end walls, masonite interior sheets, 1-inch floorboards, canvas bags filled with nuts and bolts and washers. Everything labeled, everything numbered, everything supposedly designed for foolproof assembly. The instruction manual was 42 pages long. Otto had written it himself, including detailed diagrams for every step. He'd tried to anticipate every possible mistake, every moment of confusion. Now he'd find out if he'd succeeded. By 0930 hours, the Marshall sailors had laid the floor framework on the ground, a metal grid sitting on short stilts that elevated the hut 6 inches above the earth. This allowed drainage underneath and prevented rust. The tongue and groove plywood planks snapped together like a puzzle. First mistake. 2 sailors installed panels backward, forcing them to pry the pieces apart and start over. 20 minutes lost. At noon they broke for lunch. Only the floor was complete. They were behind schedule. Otto watched them eat sandwiches and smoke cigarettes, talking among themselves in low voices. Dale Hoffman, the Iowa farm boy, was sketching something in the dirt with a stick, showing the others how the T-ribs should align with the floor framework. Leadership was emerging naturally. That was good. That meant the design wasn't completely defeating them. At 1330 hours, they resumed work. The T-ribs came next. Each rib weighed 40 pounds. 2 men had to lift while a third bolted it to the floor framework. 8 ribs total, spaced 4 feet apart along the 36-foot length. The ribs were T-shaped in cross-section. The vertical part of the T pointed skyward. The horizontal part of the T bolted to the floor. By 1500 hours, the skeleton stood complete. A rib cage of steel reaching toward the sky, looking impossibly fragile without its skin. Then came the moment Otto had been dreading. The corrugated panels. Each sheet had to overlap by exactly 2 corrugations at the sides, 6 inches at the ends. Bolt them to the T-ribs through pre-drilled holes using hex head bolts with washers on both sides. Start at the bottom, work toward the ridge, left side and right side simultaneously to maintain symmetry. Dale Hoffman figured out the rhythm first. Align the panel, clamp it temporarily, drill through the pre-marked holes, insert bolts, tighten, move to the next panel. He showed the others, and they fell into a pattern, working in pairs, calling out to each other when they needed a third hand. At 17:30 hours, with the sun dropping towards the horizon and shadows lengthening across the lot, they were attaching the last curved panel at the ridge when Dale's hand slipped. The bolt he'd been holding skittered across the curved roof, bounced off a T-rib, and clattered to the ground below. Dale froze. Son of a... He caught himself, glancing toward Otto and Peter 50 yards away. Then he searched his toolbox. No spare bolts. They'd used every fastener in the kit. Peter started forward instinctively. Otto grabbed his arm hard enough to hurt. "They solve it or it's not dummy-proof," Otto said quietly. For 30 seconds, nobody moved. Then Jimmy Torres, the Detroit mechanic, remembered something. Earlier in the day, they'd installed one panel incorrectly and had to remove it. The bolts from that mistake were sitting in a coffee can. Jimmy retrieved one and handed it up to Dale. Dale secured the ridge panel. At 1805 hours, 9 hours, and 5 minutes after start, the 10 sailors stepped back. Quonset hut number 001 stood complete. Otto walked the interior slowly, running his hand along the masonite walls. The paper insulation was visible between the outer corrugated shell and the inner masonite lining. He jumped on the floor, solid, no flex. He checked the door seal, tight. He examined every bolt connection he could reach. Then he stepped outside and circled the structure twice, looking for gaps, checking panel overlap, testing for structural soundness. The 10 sailors stood in a line, exhausted, covered in dirt and metal filings, waiting for judgment. Otto faced them. His voice came out thick, barely controlled. "Gentlemen, you just built a Quonset hut." Dale Hoffman grinned. "Does that mean we passed, sir?" "It means Admiral Moriel is about to get 8,200 of these, and it means you 10 just proved that ordinary Americans can build extraordinary things when their country needs them to." Peter was already drafting the telegram to Washington. The test was successful. Production could proceed at full scale. The Navy's gamble on an unproven design had paid off. But Otto stood alone for a moment after the sailors left, staring at the completed hut in the fading light. It wasn't beautiful. It was just a curved metal shell with a floor and walls. But it worked. 10 untrained men had assembled it in one day using hand tools and a 42-page manual. Now they had to build 8,000 more before the world caught fire. June 1941. The first production units shipped to Britain under Lend-Lease, loaded onto Liberty ships in 12-crate pallets that fit perfectly into cargo holds. Then to Iceland for cold weather testing. Then to advanced bases in the Caribbean, where tropical humidity would test whether the paper insulation could survive moisture without rotting. By September, 8,200 T-rib Quonset huts had rolled off the West Davisville production line. Fuller Company had met Admiral Moriel's impossible deadline. But the war hadn't truly started yet. These were just exercises, preparation for a conflict everyone knew was coming, but nobody could predict. Otto returned to routine work. Federal contracts, construction reviews. The adrenaline of the 60-day sprint faded into memory. He wondered sometimes if the huts would ever see real combat, or if they'd just sit in storage depots gathering dust while diplomats negotiated peace that would never come. Then, late October, brought the telegram that changed everything. Otto was reviewing foundation specifications for a warehouse expansion when his secretary knocked. "Mr. Brandenberger, this just came from Navy Department Communications." The telegram was brief, transmitted from Reykjavik Harbor, Iceland. "Quonset huts deployed Iceland. Stop initial reports. Excellent stop troops prefer to Nissan. Stop warmer, drier, faster to heat. Stop. Otto read it aloud to Peter and the engineering team. They celebrated with coffee and handshakes, the quiet satisfaction of men who'd solved a problem correctly. But the real test was still coming. Iceland sat at 64 degrees north latitude, and volcanic island in the North Atlantic, where winter meant 18 hours of darkness and weather that could kill unprepared men in minutes. The U.S. Navy had established a base at Reykjavik in July 1941, anticipating the need to protect convoy routes from German U-boats. British forces were already there, living in Nissen huts they'd shipped from England. For 2 months, the Quonsets endured Icelandic autumn. Freezing rain that turned to sleet, winds that averaged 40 knots, temperatures hovering near 0 Fahrenheit. Inside the American huts, troops stayed comfortable. The 1-inch raised floor kept them off frozen ground. The masonite walls with paper insulation held heat far better than bare corrugated steel. Small coal stoves warmed the 576 square feet in under an hour. In the British Nissen huts, men woke to frost on their blankets. The design that had served adequately on the Western Front in 1917 proved miserable at 64 degrees north. Just 2 layers of corrugated steel with an air gap between them. Elegant in theory, brutal in reality. The comparison reports flowed back to Washington. American troops sleeping warm. British troops requesting transfer to American quarters. The Quonset design was proving itself superior in exactly the conditions it had been built for. Then, November 18th arrived. The low-pressure system formed 600 miles west of Iceland. A massive counterclockwise rotation of Arctic air colliding with warm Gulf Stream water. Meteorologists at Reykjavik tracked it through the afternoon as barometric pressure dropped and wind speeds climbed. By 1800 hours, the base commander ordered all personnel to shelter. By 2100 hours, winds had built from 40 knots to 60, then 80. By midnight, the North Atlantic gale reached hurricane force. Sustained winds of 95 knots. That's 109 miles per hour. Gusts to 120 knots, 138 miles per hour. The kind of wind that turns rain horizontal, that makes breathing difficult, that picks up objects and transforms them into projectiles. In Reykjavik harbor, PBY Catalina flying boats anchored offshore tore loose from their moorings. These were massive aircraft, 63 feet long, 104-foot wingspan, 15 tons empty weight. The wind treated them like paper. Sailors watching from bunkers saw the Catalinas lifted, carried, and smashed onto the beach. Aluminum skin peeled away. Frames twisted into abstract sculptures of destruction. 3 aircraft became total losses in under an hour. On the airfield, the British Nissen huts began to fail. The design's fundamental weakness revealed itself in hurricane-force winds. The corrugated steel covering was attached to an internal wooden frame with bolts spaced every few feet. Under normal conditions, this worked fine. But at 138 miles per hour, wind found every seam, every gap between the metal skin and the wooden skeleton underneath. Pressure built inside the huts like air in a balloon. The first Nissen lost its covering at 100 hours. The corrugated steel simply ripped away from the frame, peeling back in sheets that tumbled across the airfield like enormous razor blades. British troops inside scrambled for the exit before the frame collapsed. The second hut lost its roof at 130. Wind tore through the gap, found the side panels, and shredded them in minutes. The third Nissen lost a bolt at 200 hours. Just one bolt, sheared clean through by wind pressure and structural vibration. But that single failure point propagated instantly. The frame buckled. The entire structure pancaked, collapsing into a twisted pile of corrugated steel and splintered wood. British troops huddled in a concrete bunker, watching through narrow windows as their shelters disintegrated. Some had lived in these huts for 4 months. Personal belongings, letters from home, photographs. Everything inside was now scattered across the Icelandic tundra at 100 miles per hour. The American Quonsets stood 300 yards away. The design difference seemed minor on paper. Instead of corrugated panels attached to a wooden frame, the Quonset panels bolted directly to the steel T-ribs. No intermediate structure, no gaps where wind could build pressure. The curved steel shell and the structural skeleton were integrated into a single load-bearing system. When hurricane winds hit the Quonsets, they hit solid metal. The T-rib frames didn't flex. The panels, bolted directly to those ribs at intervals of 2 feet, had no room to peel away. Wind pressure distributed across the entire curved surface instead of concentrating at weak points. Physics favored the continuous arch. Morning revealed the aftermath. 3 British Nissen huts destroyed. Personal effects scattered for miles. British personnel exhausted, demoralized, and furious at equipment that had failed when they needed it most. The American Quonsets showed minor damage. 3 panels had slight dents where debris, probably pieces of the destroyed Nissen huts, had struck at high velocity. 1 door had blown open when a sailor forgot to latch it properly. Rain soaked the interior, but the structure itself held firm. A British naval officer named Commander Hastings walked the American compound at 0700 hours, examining each Quonset methodically. He knocked on the corrugated walls. He checked the T-rib connections. He looked at the undamaged roofs while 300 yards away, his own men were salvaging what little remained of their quarters. Hastings found the American base commander, Captain Richard Walsh, drinking coffee in the operations bunker. "How much for 100 of those Yank huts?" Hastings asked without preamble. Walsh blinked. "You want to buy Quonsets?" "My men are sleeping in a concrete bunker designed for 12 people. We've got 47 personnel. Do the math, Captain. Either we get American huts or we requisition passage back to England, because I'm not putting my people in another Nissen after what I watched last night." The report cabled back to Admiral Moriel in Washington was written in the dry language of official military communications. But the message was clear. Night-gale hurricane proportion. Wrecked shipping harbor, stop crumpled piss on beach like paper hats. Stop ripped covering completely off many British Nissen huts. Stop Quonset huts, practically undamaged. Stop request immediate additional units. Stop Otto read the telegram alone in his office at the Fuller Company warehouse. Outside, October rain fell on Rhode Island. Nothing like the 100-mile-per-hour gales that had destroyed 3 Nissen huts 600 miles northeast. His hands held the flimsy paper, reading the words again. Practically undamaged. Crumpled PBYs like paper hats. The Navy had gambled on an unproven design. Fuller Company had built a factory before testing the product. Jonas Petroskas had invented a bending jig in 6 hours. 10 sailors had assembled a prototype in 1 day. And now, in the worst storm Iceland had seen in 5 years, the crazy, curved shelter had stood while its British competitor disintegrated. Otto's hands didn't shake this time. The impossible deadline had been met. The design worked. The test was passed. He allowed himself one moment of quiet pride, sitting alone in the drafting room where he'd spent 72 sleepless hours in March, redesigning the Nissen concept. Then he filed the telegram and returned to work. The war was coming. Everyone knew it now. And when it arrived, American troops would have shelter that could survive hurricanes. 3 weeks later, December 7th, 1941, the war stopped coming and started happening. December 8th, 1941. Otto arrived at the Fuller Company office at 0600 hours to find 3 urgent telegrams waiting on his desk. The Navy Department, the Army Corps of Engineers, the British Purchasing Commission, all sent within hours of the Pearl Harbor attack. The requests were identical in their desperation. More Quonsets. Immediately. As many as physically possible to manufacture. The U.S. Army wanted 16,000 additional units for bases being established across North Africa, the Middle East, and eventually Europe. The Navy doubled its standing order for Pacific theater deployment. Britain requested 5,000 more under Lend-Lease to replace Nissen huts at bases from Gibraltar to Singapore. Peter arrived 20 minutes later, still buttoning his coat. "Did you see the orders?" "We can't fill them," Otto said flatly. "The West Davisville factory is already running 3 shifts. We're at maximum capacity. Then we need more factories. That takes time, 6 months minimum to build and equip a new production facility." "We don't have 6 months. MacArthur's retreating in the Philippines right now. Wake Island is under siege. The Seabees are forming up to build advanced airstrips across the Pacific, and they need shelter infrastructure before they can deploy." Otto stared at the telegrams, feeling the same pressure he'd felt in March when Moriel handed him the impossible 60-day deadline. Except now the stakes weren't theoretical. Now American boys were dying on beaches 8,000 miles away, and the infrastructure to support them didn't exist yet. The West Davisville factory could produce roughly 400 Quonset huts per month at current capacity. The new orders totaled 37,000 units. At current production rates, that meant 7 years to fulfill. The war wouldn't wait 7 years. But production bottlenecks were already appearing. Anderson sheet metal in Providence could only bend so many corrugated panels per day. Their 3 custom jigs ran 24 hours. But the graduated pressure process Jonas Petrauskas had invented simply took time. You couldn't rush physics. Strand Steel Corporation in Detroit was producing T-rib sections, but steel allocation boards prioritized ships and tanks over shelter components. Every ton of steel used for Quonset ribs was a ton not used for destroyer hulls. Lumber shortages delayed crate construction. The 12 wooden boxes that held each disassembled hut required quality timber, and sawmills were struggling to keep up with military demand for everything from rifle stocks to cargo pallets. Worse, field reports from the first combat deployments revealed design problems Otto hadn't anticipated. The continuous arch, floor to ridge to floor, wasted interior space. Troops had to stack bunks and equipment inward, where the curve was less severe, leaving the outer edges near the walls largely unusable. A soldier 6 feet tall had to duck when standing more than 4 feet from the center line. The original 16-foot by 36-foot size proved too small for field hospitals. You couldn't fit enough beds. You couldn't establish proper triage areas. Medical staff were requesting larger versions, but scaling up the design meant recalculating load tolerances and redesigning the T-rib structure. From the South Pacific came requests for wooden huts instead of steel. In tropical humidity, metal corroded rapidly. Condensation formed on the interior masonite walls. More critically, steel conducted heat. A Quonset sitting in direct equatorial sunlight became an oven, reaching interior temperatures of 120 degrees Fahrenheit. Otto reviewed the complaints methodically, making notes in the margins. Every solution required redesign, more testing, more time. And America had no time. MacArthur was retreating toward Bataan. Japanese forces were advancing across Southeast Asia. The Seabees, Admiral Moriel's newly formed naval construction battalions, needed shelter infrastructure to build the advance airstrips that would eventually turn the tide of the Pacific War. They needed it now. Not in 6 months. Not after testing. Now. Otto put his pencil down, looked at Peter across the drafting table. "We have to start over." Peter was quiet for a long moment. Outside, December rain fell on Rhode Island. Inside, the two men who'd spent 60 days creating a shelter that survived Icelandic hurricanes faced the reality that their successful design wasn't good enough. "The vertical walls," Peter said finally. "If we add 4-foot straight walls at the base before the curve starts, we reclaim the wasted floor space. And we can switch from T-ribs to I-section ribs. Lighter weight, easier to manufacture. Strand steel can produce them faster. Make it bigger, 20 feet by 48 feet instead of 16 by 36. That's 960 square feet instead of 576. Otto was already sketching. The Quonset redesign took shape over the next 6 weeks. 4-foot vertical sidewalls created usable space along the entire perimeter. The arch became segmental, 2 curved sections instead of 3, which reduced the number of different panel sizes and simplified assembly. The switch to lighter I-section ribs cut shipping weight by 35% and manufacturing cost by 60%. They developed 86 different configurations: barracks, field hospitals, chapels, bakeries, mess halls, radio shacks, ammunition storage, vehicle repair shops, latrines, warehouses. Each variant used the same basic components, just arranged differently, with different end walls and interior partitions. For the Pacific Theater, engineers at Seattle's Pacific Hut Incorporated developed all-wood versions using pressure-treated lumber that resisted tropical rot. For Arctic warfare, the Jamesway hut used canvas stretched over a wooden frame with thick insulation, lighter to transport by air than steel Quonsets. For ordnance storage where explosions were a risk, the heavy-gauge Armco hut provided blast protection. And for massive warehouses and hangar-sized structures, they created the Elephant Hut. 40 feet wide, 100 feet long, 4,000 square feet under a single arch. The largest Quonset built during the war, a warehouse on Guam, used 42 elephant sections to create 54,000 square feet of covered storage. Strand Steel Corporation took over mass production in Detroit, converting automotive manufacturing facilities to Quonset production. By mid-1943, they were shipping 120,000 units annually. Total World War II production would reach 153,000 Quonsets of all types. But numbers on production reports didn't capture what the design meant to the men who lived in them. February 1942. A young Seabee lieutenant named Robert Miller wrote a letter home to his wife in Ohio. He was stationed at a forward base in the Aleutian Islands, building an airstrip in conditions that made Iceland look tropical. Temperatures at 30 below zero. Wind that never stopped. Darkness that lasted 20 hours a day in winter. "We got the new Quonsets yesterday," Miller wrote. "Took my crew 6 hours to assemble one, which the boys say is pretty good considering we were working in a blizzard and couldn't feel our fingers half the time. The old-timers here remember the canvas tents from last month. They say 3 men died of exposure before the Quonsets arrived. Now we've got a coal stove that keeps the interior at 50 degrees even when it's minus 30 outside. The boys are calling it the Miracle Hut. I'm just calling it the reason I might actually make it home to you when this war is over." Otto never saw that letter, never knew Robert Miller's name. But by February 1942, letters like it were being written from advanced bases across 3 oceans and 2 hemispheres: Guadalcanal, North Africa, Iceland, Alaska, New Guinea. Everywhere American forces deployed, Quonsets appeared within days, erected by construction battalions who could build shelter faster than the enemy could destroy it. The 60-day deadline had become 100